joining my lecture on scientific writing, communicating in psychology. The main objective we have when we're writing any of our science or our research is to communicate that information. And the best or biggest goal that we have is to inform the reader about the information as concisely and clearly as possible. So we don't want to be too wordy. We don't want to be vague. We want to be very direct, very clear. And sometimes this comes across as a little abrupt, but as readers we get a little used to it, and as writers we get a little used to it. But we do need some training and we need to learn some techniques. We need to be very careful when we're writing about our research that we don't have any plagiarism happening. And plagiarism, it says borrowing on the slide, but it's basically stealing as far as that goes. And it's when we're taking ideas, thoughts, words, when we're taking information that we've gotten from another source and we're not crediting them. So we always want to be really careful to make sure that we know how to do our references and our in-text citations both. It's important to understand that every entry in the reference list should be referred to in the paper. This is not a bibliography, it's a reference list. So we don't have things in our reference list that haven't been cited in our paper. And on the flip side, anything that's been cited in the paper needs to appear in the reference list. Now, sometimes we come across, we'll be reading a book or a journal article, and within what we're reading, maybe it's a book written by Smith and Warner, and they are citing Jones and Baker. It's always best to go back to the original source. So if you wanted to copy that or quote that or cite that, you want to go find Jones and Baker and find the original source. It's not a great idea to cite someone who is citing someone. That shows a pretty big weakness in your work, so you don't want to do that. A couple of other common problems that we see with student writing is a noun-pronoun disagreement, and this is typically when there's a disagreement in the number or the singular plural disagreement. You want to be careful for that. You also want to be sure that when you're speaking, you're being clear about what it is you're saying. And most of our lives, we've been taught to write in a little bit of a dramatic fashion and to add some creative words and to take some liberties with our sentences and a little bit longer and kind of on the border of run-on sentences. But science really gets away from that. We become, like I said, a little bit more abrupt. Make your sentences a slight bit shorter, more direct, more to the point, and this will help so that this will help avoid the ambiguity that we can sometimes have in sentences, and we want to avoid the run-on sentences. You also don't want to have sentence fragments, which is just having a partial sentence or an incomplete sentence. You need to know that every sentence needs to have at least one independent clause. Then there's a couple of words that we use when we speak, especially depending upon where we come from in the country. There's different trends that are happening. The word since should be referred to as time past. We don't want to say something happened since we were all there. That's not actually the correct use of it. So you want to always use since means since something has happened, since time has passed. As, a lot of people use this when they mean because. And while. While is a word that we want to use when there's a contrast or contradiction, when whereas is correct. So you want to use while only when it refers to time. Amount versus number, and this one can be a little tricky, but we want to use amount when you refer to things that you can't count, and number when it's things you can. So how many number of hours Did you study? Well, that's something that's countable. So you don't want to say the amount of hours studied. And then affect versus effect. And I have to be really honest with you. My brain absolutely cannot tell the difference between these two. But affect is used as a verb, and it means to influence. Effect is a noun. Yeah, you know what? That one's, for whatever reason, I have a complete block. So I just use the word influence when I need it. But that's my little cheat. We have then versus than. Then is a time when something occurred. So something happens, and then, with an E, then a second thing followed it. Than is when we're making comparisons. I would rather have a vanilla shake than a chocolate shake. I'm going to use THAN in that case. And quite frankly, that is true. I would rather have the vanilla shake. Some other things that we don't want to use. You do not use try and, use try to. So people don't try and get a credit card. They try to get a credit card. Do not use the word impact, interface, network as verbs. Although I'm not sure about networking. I feel like that's becoming a verb. But as of right now, it's still a noun. And you never want to write words anywheres, anyways, being as, being that, could've, should've, would've, coulda, woulda, shoulda. Irregardless is not a word, or in regards to. And even though my mother said it all the time, you don't want to write the reason is because. Because I said so. So, the term paper or literature review, these are similar. They're not quite writing for publication, but this is kind of the step before that. You can have a systematic review, and that's going to look at all of the things that are current in the topic that you're studying, and you synthesize all of the current literature that's out for that topic and present that synthesization. I'm not even sure if that's a word. And present what you've gone over and how you've categorized and what you found in all of the literature. It needs to be extremely logical when you're organizing it. And it's going to depend on what it is you're trying to show, because you might want to look at maybe different ways that articles looked at gender. So you're going to organize it one way, or maybe different ways that different articles categorized a specific symptom of something, or maybe a personality of some sort. So it depends on what it is that you're looking at will influence how you're going to organize your papers. And I think I covered that. It is to kind of synthesize and summarize what's going on. Research report's always going to have a cover page. That's the first page. It's going to include the page number up in the upper right-hand corner. It's got the title of the report, the name of the researcher, the affiliation of the researcher. Typically has a running head for a professional report. The abstract is on the next page, and that's usually it's a summary of the entire article. It's going to give a brief, very brief, it's usually limited to 120 to 200 words, depending upon who it is you're turning it into. And it's going to be a very brief synopsis of what the research was about, what was done, how it was done, what the results were. And it doesn't leave any surprises. It lets people be able to read that little snapshot, so then they think, oh wow, I do want to read this, or I do want to see this, or I do want to dig deeper. So that's what an abstract is used for. And that's usually on the second page of the report. And then on the next page, you're going to start with your introduction. And this is where the first line of the paper should be the exact same as the title of the paper. It's the heading and it's centered. In APA, we don't use the word introduction, but I think a lot of people are unaware of that. And you want to start your introduction by describing the very broad general topic or general problem, the scope of the problem, what it is that you're looking at. You want to let the reader know what other research that's been done in that area, and this might be through you showing some previous evidence or running your literature review. And you also want to describe what it is that you're doing, what your objectives are, what it is that you're planning to investigate or what you did investigate, and what you had expected to find. So you want to use very general terms. You start out with very broad terms. You're going to narrow the focus down to your work, but you're still staying general. You're going to move next into your method section. And although the word section starts with an S, method does not end in an S. It's a method section, not methods section. Just a little side note there. And this is going to continue right after the introduction section. And this is where we get very detailed about what it is that we did. And you want to think of this kind of like a recipe card. You want to be very specific. You want everybody to be able to know exactly what you did. One, so that they can replicate what it is that you did and hopefully come up with the same results. That's the best compliment we can get in science. And two, so that people can learn from exactly what you did, and they can either mimic you and do something a little bit differently, or they can mimic you, they can learn from where your limitations were. So we want to be very transparent with what we did in our method section. And we break down everything. We talk about our participants, how many there were, if there's any relevant demographic information. Maybe you were looking at people all males only, or children with on the autistic spectrum disorder, or you were looking at expecting mothers. You know, whatever. If there's a critical piece of demographic information, you want to also be sure and describe that. And then oftentimes you have a procedure section that describes maybe how the participants were recruited, if they were divided into different groups, if they had to do something, pieces of the information, pieces of the research like that. Then you've got a materials section. Now again, these are all subsections within the method section. So we have our materials, which are going to be if you gave out questionnaires, if there were specific instructions used, if you had people, maybe they were watching videos, which your videos were that you used, or looking at photos, or whatever it is that you were using. This is going to be in your materials. And then you also have, sometimes you have an apparatus, and that's if you have machinery or instruments that may have needed to been calibrated. This would be where you would put that. The procedure itself is where you want to give enough detail so that everything can be replicated, and this is where you just kind of summarize and put it all together in very detailed. It's very dry. It's very I wish you could, I'm talking with my hands, I wish you could see. You're gonna just go right down the line, very dry. This happened, this, we did this, we did this, we did this, so we did it this way, we did it this way. You're gonna be very, very detailed. And again, think of a recipe card. Then we're going to move, after the method section, you go right into the results. And this is where you're going to report both your descriptive statistic results and your inferential statistic results. You're also going to discuss whether or not your inferential statistics are significant. And you want to be sure and report this both in APA format, and then you can use so you report your results in format, but you also want to use text and words to describe conceptually what it means. So you're going to give your R statistic, maybe if you're running a correlation, and then you want to describe what that means if the two groups had a negative correlation. This is also where you can often put in some, interject some graphics or figures, sometimes tables, and depending upon what your data is and what you're trying to show, that's going to determine what sort of graphic or table you might choose. For example, if you're using data that's categorical or discrete, you're going to want to use a bar graph, which you can see on the lower left. If you're using continuous data, you're going to want to use a histogram, which you can see on the lower right. Or if you're using maybe individual data, you might want to use a scatter plot, which we have. All of this is going to depend on what the data is and what it is that you're looking at and what it is that you're trying to describe or show and how you're trying to contribute, again, back to your original problem that you started the paper with. Let's see. You also want to make sure whenever you're doing graphs that it's clear to the reader that you don't have so much information in it can't be interpreted correctly. It should be something that's presented that contributes to the paper. It's not just about the colors being pretty, but the information should be important and clear to the reader as well. And after the results, we go into our discussion section, and this is where we want to actually talk about the findings that we had. You can discuss the results and what they actually mean. And then you're going to tie that back to your original question and previous research. This is what I found, just as so-and-so and so-and-so in the previous had found that. Or these were what we saw in our study, however, previous research had not come up with the same thing. So you want to kind of tie it back in. You then want to talk about things that you did in your research that could be improved upon for the future or suggested for the future. You know, we had considered this, but we had never considered this, and in the future, this would be something great to look at. So you want to suggest further research that could be done, and if you had any limitations, if you forgot to realize different time of year could have impacted. I think I just use impact as a verb. If you forgot that different times of the year could influence your outcome, something like that, you want to put that into your limitations. And then you're going to finish with the reference page, which we sort of touched on in the beginning. And this will always begin on a new page. And, I apologize. The reference is now that we've switched from APA 6th to APA 7th, it is actually bold. And I have here that it is not bold. So sorry about that. It actually is bold. The heading for references is bold. Anything that was an in-text citation needs to be in the reference list, and the reference list should be in alphabetical order by the first author's last name. We always want to use a hanging indent. If you're not sure about something in your reference list, or where maybe how the volume number is treated, or whether the title should be title case or just upper lowercase, you can always refer to your APA manual, or you can go to the OWL Purdue website. That's a really good, handy one. And then sometimes you also might have appendices at the end. This is something that just, again, it's going to depend upon what research it is you're doing and what pieces of information you have that you feel are important to have in the report. These are things that are probably not critical to have in the report, but for somebody who's really in your field and really, they might want to come along later and see it. Sometimes these are maybe tables, longer, bigger kind of tables full of maybe raw data or something like this that wouldn't make sense in the report itself, but somebody may want to see that later. Some general typing guidelines. You want to always, in APA, we want to be double spaced throughout the entire paper, and you need to make sure you have no extra space. between the lines. So you always want to go into, sorry about that, I hit the microphone. You always want to go into your Word document, go into the Home tab, go into the Layout tab, and when you're there, look at the boxes to the right of before and after. They should both be 0. If the after is a 6 or an 8, you want to be sure and make that as 0, and that will remove that additional space between paragraphs or headings. You don't want that entire extra line or space between paragraphs. The only time we see that is on the title page, right after the title, the very first page. We left justify everything we left align everything for the text, and we always indent 3 to 6 spaces, usually 5, but we always indent our paragraphs in APA. You want to use like a serif font, such as Times New Roman, set at 12. All margins should be 1 inch, and the page number should be in the upper right-hand corner of the paper. Some other general guidelines for typing: you leave the footer blank. And this is a weird one for me. It says do not staple your report, use a paper clip. And I have to be honest, I have never, ever not stapled my report. However, there is a rule out there. So if someone says that, I wouldn't balk too much. I would just simply follow their suggestion and use a paper clip. But typically, I do staple. You always want to introduce your tables, figures, or appendices in the text. You can do this by in parenthetical quotes. You can just put table 1 or table 4 or figure 2. But you always want to introduce them in the text, as well as you also want, when you're writing them, they should have a heading and their own title. Again, indent for paragraphs, and we use our hanging indent for the reference list. And I've discovered that a lot of people have a real hard time with the hanging indent, and I have another video, so you need to watch it if you're having a problem with it. It's so easy. It's the click of like 2 buttons and your entire reference list has a hanging indent. So just check that out if you need help with that. So we can also present our research a few other ways. We can do an oral presentation. A lot of times this requires a lot of information to be condensed into a small amount of time and a small amount of space, believe it or not. At a conference, if you're doing an oral presentation, you usually have 15 or 20 minutes to present the material, or sometimes you might have an hour, but there could be like 50 or 100 people. And so all doing a poster, I'm sorry, that's a poster. You have about 15 or 20 minutes to present the material. I'm just confusing my thoughts here at the end of this PowerPoint. But you have about 15 or 20 minutes, and then you'll have questions for a few minutes. So it's pretty quick. I've even done some that are 10 minutes. So you need to determine what's important, what can get out clearly and efficiently. You want to be thorough. A lot of times with oral presentations, the computer software is going to be PowerPoint, kind of like I'm doing right now. And one of the best ways to be successful is to just practice and don't be nervous, which people are still working on that. The other thing you can do is a poster. Sorry, I sort of interwove and I kind of integrated those two thoughts. But we also have poster presentations, and this is a good way to start. When I was very nervous about talking to people, I found that the poster presentation was the best way to get used to presenting my work, because you just stand by it and people will come around and talk to you, and it's sort of a one-on-one, and it's a little bit less intimidating than standing up in front of the room and having to very quickly give all of your research. So this is a great thing for students. You can participate in scholarly conferences by submitting a poster. You should always look professional. The poster should contain all of the important information, not necessarily every detail about the method and results, but important information so that if you happen to be talking to person A, person B could also be reading over, and they should be able to understand what's going on. Again, you're usually going to be standing by it, so there are questions. And oftentimes you can even print maybe a larger piece of paper like the 11 by 14, and you can hand that out to people that are interested. So that is the end of our talk today. And if you have any questions, let me know. Thanks. Have a great day. Bye.